Okay, well I think Allysin and I are here. We usually one early, so we're good. So welcome to Speaking Drupal, a cultural linguistic adventure. Hashtag this is an adventure, hashtag MidCamp. I'm jgjwolf, and this is Allysin McKay. So Allysin is an application architect at GE, and I'm a web project manager at the University of Michigan. And so when I approached Allysin about wanting to propose a talk for MidCamp, she and I were talking about different things that we wanted to really present within the community realm. And we really discussed what it was like for us when we were noobs for Drupal. We're kind of still on the learning curve there. But one of the hardest things that we realized was feeling like we didn't understand the Drupal language, and so therefore we felt like we couldn't contribute to the community or felt like we were really part of the community. And so we wanted to figure out how we could talk about this as a conversation. Like, how do we talk about Drupal? How do we talk about community? How are the two interact? So this is an Allysin quote. She found lots of really great quotes for us for thinking about language. And so, for example, like, meow means wolf in cat. And so Drupal is technically in English, but it is its own sort of language.
Yeah, and this is something that we found like when we were working with people who were new, is I would explain something and their heads would shake physically, and there is a language barrier here. There's something going on. And so we looked for examples of this, some place to like confirm our sort of suspicions that yeah, there was an actual language here. So we went to the forums and we talked to a lot of people. And we found some forum questions, and I'm not going to read this one, it's actually a little bit cut off. But this person had self-identified as being new to the community and was asking, how do I basically create a table of information, you know, like that has, let's say, movie titles, for example, and I can sort them and I can list them. And they were like, do I just import my whole database into Drupal? And the response that this person got for their question that they had asked in English was completely in Drupal. And I'm not saying this is not like a valid response, but for someone who had just asked if they should import their whole database, they got a response that didn't want to like validate anything that they were saying, but it also is completely in Drupal. So they started off saying we don't need modules, and then they talked about core, content types, titles, and they just go on, and there's just like a huge language mismatch there. And so this is something that they're like, oh yeah, this is what's happening is if you're an expert in the field or in your community, you tend to respond in that language because you're saying how you view it, how you see it, right? And so we wanted to dig into this and get a better sense for it.
And we also felt like this was a missed opportunity on both parties' parts.
Yeah.
So for this session, we really wanted to think about what are different ways of thinking about Drupal community. And if you're not struggling, and if you're at MidCamp, you probably already feel like you're part of the community. What is it like for people that do struggle with this? What is it like to try and remember what it was like to be a noob? And really to open up a dialogue with you to figure out what are ways in which we're doing a really great job and what other ways can we improve. So it's audience participation, so you guys should all have whiteboards in front of you. They're kind of sketchy. This is what I did with my like English second language students as a whiteboard. And so we're going to have you go through this.
Okay, so this is our sentence. It's from documentation for beginners, right? And it says, since blank is stored as blank because blank becomes the same basic information, Drupal core and contributor modules can handle all blank in a standard manner. So what I did is deconstruct it, took out the words, and we'd like you to guess which one would be the correct answer for this sentence.
We did Tommy Jeopardy too.
Write it down on your boards.
Yeah. We'll have you hold them up so no one's going to see if you got the right or the wrong answer. I got it wrong when Allysin pulled it from me.
Yeah, little quiz. Got Jeopardy.
Oh, that's I'm sorry. Sorry, Jeopardy. Copyright people. All right, you're all looking up at me, I'm assuming.
We've got 1A.
Got 1A. Come on, you guys. Michael Hess, participate.
I'm reading it. It takes me a while to go back.
Yeah, no, it's time.
Yeah, that's kind of.
All right, so I see an answer back here on his board. He's picked A. Okay, so we've got A coming out strong.
None of these are right.
Which one you pick? C. Okay, we've got A, C. You say nothing's right.
That's not an option, Michael.
All right, we'll go on. So this is kind of a trick question because the right answer from the documentation is actually C. So since content is sort of nodes, nodes contain the same basic information, Drupal or contributor modules can handle all content in a standard manner. However, I think we could say they're all like valid choices to put in there, and we could all make sense of them because we've got, if you have experience, right? So someone new coming in the language, if we're moving the words around and the meanings are slightly different and nuanced, it can be a huge challenge, right? And we can't, and we've got people saying, you know, none of them are right. So if we can't come to an agreed meaning, you can really, like one of the cliffs, right, is getting adoption in Drupal, is understanding what people are talking about and making sense of everything. So.
All right, so I sent out a tweet yesterday, and we learned the hard way that apparently the way to get feedback for your sessions is not to tweet out to MidCamp. So we wanted to get information from people about what their own personal definition of what a node was. And so like the documentation has its own, and people have criticized that a little bit. But we'd love to pull you guys. Like what, if you were having to sit down and explain to someone that was new to Drupal what a node is, what would you say?
Or if you are new to Drupal,
what do you think it is?
you have a way of talking about it yet. So do we have, let's just, who's a beginner in here? Anyone? Okay.
Okay.
So can anyone put like a, you know, define a node? Yeah.
Collection of fields.
Yeah. Okay. What about yours?
A piece of content.
You had your hand up. What's up?
We're going to say content.
Yeah. That's exactly.
I mean, that's what the definition of a node is. It's a piece of content. But if we think about that,
And a collection of
and a
fields.
collection of fields. So like, how significant is that for a language, for this specific term to have like several different meanings across it, and like how we're using it in documentation, how worthwhile is that for beginners? So, thinking about this in regards to how we think about language as a whole, like the limits of my language are the limits of my mind. All I know is what I have words for. And so if we're trying to introduce this new language, so if we're talking about content types and nodes and entities, none of that, that's all a different language for me. So all I have is what I currently know, which is English, and what I might have from my other backgrounds bringing into it if I have been working in web development. But that can be kind of confining if that doesn't translate one-to-one with the Drupal language. So we get down to like, how do we speak Drupal? And when you first start learning a foreign language, you start with a lot of the grammar, and so that's kind of what we broke it down into. So nouns, a review for you all, a noun is a person, animal, place, thing, or idea. And so the way that we're using that for Drupal are for basically static nouns in a sentence. So we have views, we have content types. We're not going to go through and define what each of these are because we only have 30 minutes, and we don't need to get that far into grammar. But really, when we're constructing the Drupal language, this is what we're using as for nouns and for objects. And then for verbs, where we're talking about an action, a state, or occurrence, these are other things that we talk about. So I might say, well, I'm going to like create a content type, or I'm going to build a forum, I'm going to run clone. So these are verbs that I'm using that are also Drupalized. And any Drupal noun can kind of be a verb, but some are more resistant than others, and which can be a further complication
Right,
in
and
language.
And one thing that's actually really interesting about like the nouns and the verbs as like the core grammar concepts right here for Drupal is I was speaking with someone who is not, who doesn't speak English as their first language, and they were letting me know that with among their friends who also speak another language, native tongue, they use English because they can't translate these concepts into their language and it doesn't work. And so you're saying, yeah, there are sort of concepts here that we can't translate as well because they're meaningful unto themselves.
So Allysin did some really great sentence diagramming here.
I don't know if you remember sentence diagramming. I was never very good at it, but I wanted to like break down a sentence and see like what are we actually using? How are we building meaning, right? Or how are we putting together these blocks to build meaning? So this is a sentence I heard yesterday in a session for beginners. And the sentence is, if you create a node of content type group, you can view content for that group. And so the actual logic behind the meaning here, and for those of you who are proficient in reading for diagramming, or if you're new to it, it's subject, verb, object. So our first is subject, verb, object. We create nodes, so node being the object, which would refer to the nouns. And then of the content type is the indirect object. The node of content type, but here we have a descriptive, a group, which is acting as like an adjective, right? Because it's describing the content type. And then further in the sentence, we have the subject, verb, object again, and it's you view content. And notice that view here is the verb and not the noun. So another confusing part, especially if you're learning English and English at the same time. But then you have the indirect object for group. And so group is actually transformed through action in the sentence from being a descriptive part of speech, describing your content type, to actually being its own noun here. And so what I find interesting here is the way that our language changes throughout it, and how we can reuse words and like their meaning can change throughout the sentence. And I find that that can be quite confusing for people coming into the language, right? And that's something that we need to just be aware of when we speak, especially when we're speaking with new people or speaking with people outside the community.
All right, so once you understand like the basic grammar in the foreign language, then you start trying to speak with other people to make sure that the sentences that you're constructing and the meaning that you're trying to get across is understandable to someone else. And that's how you can understand that what you're saying is correct, and that's how you have an agreed upon meaning. And so the way that this works is you have connotation and denotation. And so denotation is basically the dictionary definition. And so one of the examples that we pulled from here is you have core. And core, our glossary definition for Drupal.org, is the files and modules included with the Drupal project. And so that has a very confining meaning to it, and that's what we define it as. However, it also has a connotation, which is the secondary significance. And this is really interesting because the connotation is what comes from the group itself. It's not a formal defined meaning, but it's something that everyone comes to consensus around. And so for core, it's not just a group of files, but it's also this living project that people are working on. And you might not necessarily know that connotation if you're just starting out within the community. And so it takes time and it takes context. And I think camps and conferences can be incredibly inclusive from a standpoint of view, but if you can't get people to these camps where they're going to be able to communicate with other people and start building knowledge surrounding the secondary meaning, then it's an unfortunate loss on our parts. And so then once you have the connotation and the denotation, really the community is what creates the shared meaning and the agreed upon meaning. And that's just when community comes together. And so you see this really coming through practice, which is experience and exposure. And so as a new person into the community, you're really only going to develop language if you're able to talk to people on forums, if you're able to attend meetups, if you're able to go to camps and classes and get access to YouTube. And some of that requires a little bit of bravery on the new person's part to enter into a community that they might see as being full of experts and not quite sure where their role is within that community.
Or having a well-publicized
Yeah. That's it. It's kind of that.
So one of this quote is kind of great because it sums up how I view this. Is if we were able to speak Drupal, we'd be able to enter into the community like from day one, no problems, right? And Wittgenstein says that if you speak a different language, you see a different world. And I think this is really true. As you come to really start to understand these words that you're using to ask questions or within the documentation, you start to make more sense of Drupal and start to understand sort of things, the Drupal way and what that is. But that comes through the practice and it having the meaning.
And so really another question we have to ask ourselves is how do you know when you're a member of the community? And so one of the ways that you know is in languages that can use the slang. And Drupal has its own form of slang. We talk about the Drupal way, we talk about hacking core, and every time someone talks about hacking core, a kitten cries. That's what Michael has to say.
It's not my fault though.
Fake attribution. Or asking people like, what's your handle? And so we have this really interesting culture here where it's your Drupal.org handle that people are more likely to know you by than by your first and last name. Another thing that we came across yesterday that we thought was like D.O, and I was able to interpret what that meant Drupal.org because I have enough context and because I know enough about the Drupal language. But if you're brand new, you might not have enough of that kind of baseline to be able to jump to make assumptions about.
Right, and if you have any questions about any of these, feel free to ask.
Yeah.
Now we're ready.
Yeah. So the other part about how you know that you're part of the community is if you're participating. And so there's actually various levels of participation that people can engage with, the same way that there's different levels of fluency. And so there's the virtual where you can be communicating on the forums or contributing back with, I think there's Drupal participation where you're able to take screenshots, you're able to make corrections. There's also this face-to-face that we talked about earlier with meetups and camps. But there's also ways of establishing credibility within the community because you even though Drupal is very welcoming, like, there is a level of hierarchy for like who are the beginners, who are the people that have been here a lot longer, and like where the network's existing. And the way you get integrated into that is if you are actually showing up and participating. Like Allysin would like to focus, really it's just about showing up most of the time. But we need to feel like we can actually create an environment where people feel like they can show up even if they aren't considered experts in the Drupal language. Yeah. The other part is once you're part of a community, it's about sharing and it's about contributing back. And so I think it's very easy for people that might not be beginners but might not consider themselves experts to not know how they can contribute or feel like I don't know enough to be able to explain to someone what something is. So when you know what a node is, can you then explain what a node is to someone else that's new? And you guys all shared something, and a lot of you mentioned that you thought you were beginners, but you were still able to get the correct answer for what a node is. But I think that's also, you're at a really interesting junction because you still know enough about how confusing some of the language is, and so it's easier for you to also interpret to other people. So you might say, in Drupal, a node is a piece of content. But really what that means for me is X. And so being able to make that translation is incredibly important and incredibly vital. And even once you know something, it's important to give back, which I think we actually do a fairly decent job of giving people a variety of opportunities to give back in the Drupal.org Contribute module, where even if you're a beginner, there's ways that you can give back.
Yeah. So we say speak the language is take on the world and the culture. And for Drupal, I think that's very true. You don't just speak it, you take on the community aspect that comes with it. And I think that's one of the most impressive aspects to Drupal, is that these two come together, and that's quite strong. And so we'll talk briefly here about how do we effectively communicate? And this is not just within Drupal community, we're also talking externally. So communicate to people outside of our community. I think one of the key things is we need to focus on the translation and making sure we're establishing that coherence, so the agreed meaning. So one example would be, asking questions. So how do we effectively ask questions, given that we maybe now have a sense of the grammar parts and the syntax, which is that, or the semantics, which is the meaning. And how do we effectively answer questions? So to demonstrate this, I think if we go back to that original question and answer from the forum, and if you remember from the forum, we had someone asking about how do they create a table, a dynamic table of content display that could be edited and people could submit content to. And so this is the answer, and I'm suggesting maybe can we rethink this and can we rewrite this in a way that would be a more effective answer for that person? And I'll open it up to the audience if you have any immediate responses to this or reactions or suggestions. If you have anything.
Well,
Yeah.
Could you go back to the original question?
Yes.
No, not that one. So what I want to
Cut off on the projection,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
So what they're asking for is they're like, I'm a web developer, but I haven't built in Drupal before. And so what I want to do is just a simple database page for a series of podcasts, basically a list of the recordings that are available on the site in a tabular format with the speaker name, presentation name, and cover image. But I want them as a database where each field is a link rather than a manually entered list of static text, because I would like for users to be able to click on the date header and sort the whole list by date, or click on the speaker name header and have the list sort by name. So that's kind of what they're asking for, is this dynamic table. But they don't know if they should be importing their MySQL database into Drupal to do that.
Yeah, we didn't put the whole thing in there just for space.
Yeah.
But yeah, they had originally suggested importing their own database.
And then this is the response that they got. And they indicated you don't need any modules, this can be done with core, and this is how you're going to go about doing that. So if you were trying to translate this answer, if you were trying to respond to that first person that's asking how do I create a table that might not be fluent in Drupal, how would we then translate this into something that they might understand a little bit more readily?
So we're not asking to solve the problem.
No.
But we just want to put this out here. So I have a suggestion, and it's not the new answer, but it's a new way of thinking about how we answer, which is First, we need to translate what they're saying or what we're going to say. And then we need to define what we're saying. So if we're going to say you don't need a module, you probably need to explain, define what the module is, and then explain the reasons why you do or don't need it. And then at the end of your answer, once you've done, the translation from the English to the Drupal, define, explain. It's also confirm. And so this part I think is really, really key, is when you confirm and ask for the confirmation, saying, here's my answer, was this helpful, please provide feedback. And that does two things. One, make sure that you are communicating effectively, but it also latches onto that community concept where you are bringing that person back and they feel like a sense of belonging there and they've been helped. So I think this is one suggestion for how we can communicate effectively. And so I think this actually works within the community as well as externally to the community.
And I think the other part that can be very complicated for people is that there's a lot of text in our Drupal documentation. There's a lot of text on Drupal.org, but primarily what we're building is very visual. And so, for example, I think we're doing a better job of this, but if you go to the WYSIWYG module, originally what you would see is it allows the use of client-side editors to edit content. It simplifies the installation and integration of the editor of your choice. And it wouldn't necessarily have this image to explain what the WYSIWYG looked like or how it would actually look on my site. And so it might be very difficult for me as a new person to understand how this matches my mental model of what kind of site I want to be constructing. And so I think it's also to be very conscious of this when we're communicating with people, that the things that you're communicating about in the interactions tend to be very visual interactions. So this is something we can think about integrating into when we're responding to questions.
Right, and I think it supplements the development of the language. It's to have the visual there to actually provide more context to the words as people are learning to use them readily in their speech.
And so we think the Drupal.org and the community is doing a fairly decent job, but we think there's always opportunities for improvement. And so, for example, can we help model a better way of asking questions? So if you're new to the community, helping them understand where to put questions they're asking. And we have a little bit of a breakdown in that, in the way that forms are set up, but even that kind of language is Drupalized. And so you might not understand where your question fits in within that language context. And really, I think, encouraging people to participate more and figuring out ways to break down that participation barrier. And I think what's primary for us is to really remember that fluency takes both experience and patience on both people's parts. And so it's important for people that are part of the community to figure out how they can to use their experience to help others, be patient with that learning curve. As well as it's also equally important for the people that are new to be patient with themselves and learning the secondary language.
Yeah. And lastly, it's our responsibility, as a community of new members and old members to shape the language. And so we'll end with this quote that the only language which do not change are the dead ones. So we are able to change the way we talk about things within Drupal, and that can be specific, to the connotation or the denotation, but we're able to shift that and we can maybe make it more accessible. So as we move forward, I'll leave you with that, and let's discuss. So, do you have any questions, comments, gripes? Yes.
I think one of the biggest benefits and problems in the Drupal community is that you've got people coming from all different walks of life. And so when you're asking questions, I came to the community as a programmer, but on IBM computers, so not even web development and stuff. You got a large group of people that came from the web development community to Drupal. And so I'm learning one way of programming about how you set up your database and everything. I come in and say, well, I'm having problems understanding what a node is, what some of the other aspects of Drupal. And I get the comments about, well, we're really trying to abstract that, so you don't need to know how that's set up in the database or this or that. And yet, for me to understand it, it's helpful. And I'm sure people coming from other areas, it's the same thing. It's the language. You've got one person that maybe came in as a web developer trying to explain it to somebody that's just coming in from the community and saying, I think developing websites would be a great thing to do. And so they're coming at each other, not understanding maybe necessarily where the other person is coming from. But at the same time, the diversity is really helpful, because then that person comes in and says, well, maybe I can help make this area stronger or whatever. So
And I think to your point that fits in with the kind of you only understand a language in relationship to a language you already understand. Since you programming in computers, your way of understanding Drupal is going to be very different from someone else's. And so I think for us it's important to figure out who else can we connect you with that has gone through that same language transition. Because it's not like it is in English, but we're all coming at it from different angles.
But it's also important to the group too, because I can see other ways of using Drupal or even tools. I've used different programming tools on the corporate side that I look at what's coming up in the community and what's available to them, and they're pretty good, but I see a lot of features that I miss or things like that, so it can all help improve the community.
Yes.
I think as a pretty new beginner to it myself, I think one of the things that I have the biggest challenge with understanding, I think it's still grappling with a little bit, is how many of the modules share names that in just general English would be something that makes that could mean the same thing, like panels, views, blocks, displays, and how depending on their use case and how they're said, it can be used interchangeably. And to understand the differences between what each one of these different components does and how it operates has been a really challenging thing to learn, more than necessarily the technology itself and the module. Understanding the module is why is this named in such a way that it's harder to understand.
Yeah, I definitely think that is something that I've heard repeated. Some of the words are confusing because we want to associate a direct meaning to something because we have to make sense of it initially, and that's just the challenge. And words do have duplicitous meanings as well within it. So yeah, very big challenge. I think what I would say is the solution or a potential is the experience. So think of it as the true foreign language. It's only through like the repeated practice that you come to the understanding, as well as finding someone who can provide those translations or help to build context for understanding it. But yeah, definitely a very true point.
Yeah, you're definitely not alone in that at all.
They do a good job of that. Like with commerce, they'll have a page that has a list of commerce modules that would be helpful, or advanced forum, a list of modules that go with that. So, but the hard part is finding those things, finding that those resources are available or coming in, and where do I start?
Yeah.
Yeah, is there a Drupal dictionary online or some other online tools?
There is a glossary I can
There's a glossary, which is those what we refer to as the denotations and the defining meaning. But things change in the context, which was his point, is we have a lot of changing meanings. So yeah, but there is a dictionary where the glossary is available to you.
I think one thing, oh man, this is terrible. One thing we didn't cover, I think, is the process through which people come to Drupal, which we think might not completely match up with the way that we go about learning a foreign language, or the way that we go about learning how Drupal is set up. So people come to Drupal when they're basically wanting to build a website, and so they come with specific intentions and meanings, and so they kind of want to jump into building it, versus the way that we structure a foreign language, which is where you learn the grammar first. You learn the vocabulary, you learn the nouns, you learn the verbs, you figure out how pieces fit together, and figure out how to communicate with people. And that's how a lot of the documentation is set up. But that might not completely match with the ways people expect to go about learning the process.
Anything else? Anything else to add? Comments?
All right, you guys are great. Thanks for participating.